I very frequently get topic suggestions from fans, but it's pretty rare that I get them from someone who is decidedly not a fan. Recently, I received a comment that referred to me as the history jerk. The person's complaint was that I had disrespected, although he used a more colorful term, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh veterans by interchangeably using the terms England and United Kingdom. And while I certainly never intended to belittle the contributions of Irish, Scottish, and Welsh soldiers in the many wars fought by the United Kingdom, it is a fair complaint. We here in America do tend to interchangeably use the terms England, Britain, and United Kingdom. And that's easy to understand because the United Kingdom unites two kingdoms, one of which doesn't even exist anymore, and four countries, none of whose relationship to the broader nation is really the equivalent of a U.S. state. It's difficult to understand. In fact, the history of how the United Kingdom became united and how united it really is rather complex. But luckily, the person who called me the history jerk said that he would forgive me if I would explain how all that fits together, which seems a rather odd thing to ask of a Yank, but I will give it my best shot. The United Kingdom came to exist on January 1st, 1801, as a result of the Acts of Union, passed by the Parliaments of Great Britain and Ireland the previous year. Originally called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, the Acts merged the Parliaments of Great Britain and Ireland into a single Parliament of the United Kingdom. But this is already confusing. England and Ireland already had the same monarch, George III. Why was there a need for union? And where does Scotland and Wales fit into this? And as the Republic of Ireland has repealed these acts in their entirety, how is there still a United Kingdom? The start of the consolidation of smaller kingdoms that would eventually result in the United Kingdom began, according to tradition, when Kenneth MacAlpin, king of the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata, annexed his kingdom to the kingdom of the Picts to unite two of the largest kingdoms in the north of the island of Great Britain, the largest of the British Isles. This political shift was likely precipitated, or at least encouraged, by the need for mutual defense or confusion caused by Viking raids that had been occurring since the 8th century. It is unclear, however, if the unification was a mutual decision or came due to military conquest. Combining the two, the new kingdom was called the Kingdom of Alba, essentially a Gaelic word for the Kingdom of the Picts. The central or Gaelic portion of the kingdom came to be called Scotia, a Latin name for the Gaels, and eventually the entire kingdom would come to be called Scotland. Unification in the south, traditionally reckoned to have occurred on July 12, 927, was also motivated by Viking invasions of the 19th century. After a nearly century-long process of reconquering Anglo-Saxon lands from Norse invaders, the kings of Britain, representing the 5 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms known as the Heptarchy, proclaimed Aethelstan, who was king of both the kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex and styled King of the Anglo-Saxons, to be King of England. The name England was derived from the Angles, referring to the Germanic peoples who would occupy Great Britain in the post-Roman period and essentially a catch-all term for the Anglo-Saxons. England means land of the Angles. The name was retained even after the Norman conquest in the 11th century. But an area in the southwest of the island, bordered by the Irish Sea to the north and west and the Bristol Channel to the south, resisted the Germanic Anglo-Saxon conquest. These were descendants of the Britons, Celtic people who had inhabited the island before the Roman and Anglo-Saxon conquests. While its etymology is complex, the Anglo-Saxons used the word Welsh to refer to the non-Germanic peoples of the island, particularly Britons, and the name Wales referred to their lands. For most of its history, Wales was not a single kingdom, but ruled by multiple kings, although those kingdoms were briefly consolidated under Llewellyn ap Griffith between 1057 and 1063. Before again being split into multiple kingdoms. While these kingdoms were able to attain some autonomy and briefly recognized as a principality with de facto independence, the kings and lords of Wales were for the most part, in various ways, subordinate to the kings of England. However, many local lords still maintained local laws and customs. In 2 Acts of Parliament in 1535 and 1542, partly as the result of persistent local uprisings, King Henry VIII extended the laws of England throughout Wales. As the Act says, some rude and ignorant people have made distinction and diversity between the king's subjects of this realm, and his subjects of the said dominion and principality of Wales, whereby great discord, variance, debate, division, murmur, and sedition hath grown between his said subjects. The effect was to annex Wales directly to the Kingdom of England. While Ireland has a long history of its own kings, the kingdom that would become part of the United Kingdom was a product of the Tudor era as well. Anglo-Norman England had invaded Ireland in the 12th century, taking control of large parts of the island, but the conquest was not complete. The area controlled by the monarchs of England was called the Pale. Centered around Dublin, the Pale was protected by a wall and ditch and was not considered a kingdom but a lordship. The king's authority was administered by a Lord Deputy. The crown had little authority over the Gaelic people on the other side of the wall, giving rise to the phrase, beyond the pale, meaning outside acceptable behavior. While many Irish lords swore some allegiance to the English crown, they were often in rebellion. In response, in 1541, King Henry VIII had the Parliament in Ireland pass an act changing the protectorate to a kingdom, with Henry declared King of Ireland in 1542. The Tudor conquest of Ireland took more than 70 years to accomplish, included military campaigns, but also processes of assimilating traditional Irish lords into an English feudal system. Mostly, however, it was accomplished by a plantation system, whereby Irish lands were confiscated and colonized with settlers from Great Britain. Despite the conquest, Ireland was a separate kingdom with its own parliament and largely ruled by a privy council appointed by the English monarch. Thus, it was a personal union, two different kingdoms sharing the same monarch. Scotland had its own monarch, but there was an important connection. In 1503, Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII and sister to Henry VIII, married King James IV of Scotland. The marriage was the outcome of the 1502 Treaty of Perpetual Peace, intended to end centuries of conflict between the two kingdoms. That peace only lasted about a decade before the two resumed the long-standing tradition of invading each other, but after James IV's death, their son was crowned James V of Scotland at the age of just 17 months in 1513. And thus the monarchs of England and Scotland were cousins. Now, please understand, I'm not trying to explain the entire history of these kingdoms. I've skipped by many rebellions and foreign invasions and various events that affected their borders. But what is important to know is that the three kingdoms that would eventually unite were all established by 1603. That year marked the end of the Tudor period, as the last Tudor monarch, Elizabeth I, died without an heir on March 24th, at age 69. With no direct heir, the crown fell to Elizabeth's first cousin, twice removed, James Stuart, otherwise known as James VI, King of Scotland, who thus inherited the titles King of England and King of Ireland. The three kingdoms were now under the same monarch, but they were still not unified. Each maintained its own parliament and laws. James, who was James VI of Scotland but James I of England and Ireland, had every intention of officially uniting the kingdoms, but there was opposition. The issue was quite complex. It would have required rewriting the laws, renegotiating treaties, and, to be blunt, neither kingdom much liked or trusted the other. One issue was religious. Both nations had their own church, and while both Protestant, the Church of Scotland had a Calvinist bent as opposed to the Episcopalian bent of the Church of England. In fact, to avoid jealousy from either kingdom, James took the title King of Great Britain, an odd title, given that there was yet no such kingdom. The parliaments of England and Scotland did take the issue under consideration, but failed to find resolution during most of the century-long period of Stuart rule. Acts to unify the kingdoms failed in 1606, 1667, and 1689. In fact, despite being under a single monarch, the kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland engaged in a number of conflicts that became collectively known as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. These various rebellions, invasions, and civil wars were fought over the relative authority of the kingdoms, issues of religion and religious tolerance, Irish opposition to the plantation system, and, most of all, the question of the authority of the king versus Parliament. And this chaotic period would lead to the first time that the three kingdoms were actually combined. The United Kingdom that came before the United Kingdom, only it didn't include the kingdom part. Perhaps the most remembered of the many conflicts of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms were the two English civil wars, pitting the new model army of Parliament and Oliver Cromwell against royalists supporting King Charles I. While the English Civil War could be the subject of several episodes, the end result was that the king was defeated, captured, and executed. By the end of the fighting, parliamentary forces had defeated not just the English royalists, but both Scotland and Ireland in brutal campaigns. The Cromwellian conquest of Ireland is estimated to have killed 5% of the island's entire population. All were then combined into a single commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland. But this arrangement was not a united kingdom. The kingdoms had been dissolved. It was a republic. But this period, called the interregnum, only lasted 11 years, between 1649 and 1660. After Oliver Cromwell's death in 1658, the Commonwealth crumbled amid conflict between the army and Parliament, and the inability of his successor, his son Richard, to maintain the alliances that had held them together. Charles I's son, Charles II, was restored to the throne. The Commonwealth was dissolved. In fact, it was declared never to have actually existed. The parliaments of Scotland and Ireland were also restored, and once again the three kingdoms went back to being three separate kingdoms, all under the same king. That would change under the last of the Stuart monarchs, Queen Anne. Uniting the kingdoms of England and Scotland was one of her primary goals, but the driving factor was that she had failed to produce an heir. As the succession rules were different in Scotland and England, this could have led to a succession crisis. And to resolve the issue, a Treaty of Union was negotiated in 1706, followed by Acts of Union in the Parliaments of England and Scotland in 1707, uniting the kingdoms of Scotland and England into a single kingdom called the Kingdom of Great Britain. Anne became the first monarch of the kingdom, and succession was given to the House of Hanover, descendants of the oldest daughter of James I of England and VI of Scotland. This period also saw the ascendancy of Parliament and the rise of the role of the Prime Minister and a more defined constitutional monarchy. It was under one of these Hanoverian kings, George III, that the Kingdom of Ireland would be added to the Union. The Parliament of Ireland had always been subservient to the Parliament of England and then Great Britain, and largely excluded the Irish Catholic majority. A rebellion in 1798 prompted action, partly under the belief that the Irish Catholic majority had been mistreated and that full status in the kingdom would prevent future rebellion. The Acts of Union were passed in the Parliaments of Ireland and Great Britain in 1800, and on January 1st, 1801, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was formed. No longer were these three kingdoms connected merely by personal union. They were a single kingdom. So this might surprise you, but despite what you've heard, there is no Queen of England. There's no Queen of England for the very simple reason that there is no Kingdom of England and hasn't been since the Acts of Union in 1707. Elizabeth II is the Queen of the United Kingdom. This union was then disrupted by the Irish Home Rule movement, which eventually led to the Partition of Ireland in 1921, separating Northern and Southern Ireland. The initial goal was eventual reunification, but that was not to be. The Anglo-Irish Treaty allowed the 6 counties of Northern Ireland to opt out of joining an Irish republic and remain within the United Kingdom, which, largely populated by descendants of colonists from Great Britain, they chose to do. The name of the United Kingdom was changed to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Opposition and support for the partition has led to significant violence, which continues today. The partition also raises an odd irony. Northern Ireland is not today, and never was, a kingdom. The United Kingdom today, in fact, unites no kingdoms. And so the history of how the United Kingdom became the United Kingdom is rather complex, and that history still impacts the modern nation. Unlike the United States, where all the states entered the Union under the same terms, the 4 countries that make up the United Kingdom all entered at different times for different reasons, and the relationship to the broader national government is not equal. In some cases, they have more independence than a U.S. state, but in many cases or other ways, they do not. And that history has led to growing nationalist movements within the United Kingdom, notably leading to the 2014 failed referendum calling for Scottish independence. This leaves a question about the ubiquitous term Britain. Britain is one of the oldest known place names for the islands, dating back to the times of ancient Greece and likely a transliteration of a Celtic term. At one point, the term referenced the people who populated the island before the Roman and Anglo-Saxon conquest, but since the 1707 Acts of Union, the term has been used to help establish a common identity. But the term is still complex. Residents of the 3 British Crown dependencies and 14 self-governing British overseas territories are generally considered to be British, but they are not part of the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, the British identity is seen differently within the United Kingdom. A 2018 survey by the BBC found that while 59% of people in Scotland felt strongly British, 84% felt strongly Scottish, whereas in England a higher percentage identify as strongly British than strongly English. And of course, the United Kingdom is a broad, multicultural nation with significant populations who did not descend from any of the 4 countries represented in the United Kingdom. As to the original complaint, the English army and the Scots army were combined after the Acts of Union in 1707, and it is fair to say that whenever the English go to war, so does the rest of the kingdom. Scottish, Irish, and Welsh regiments, and of course troops from throughout the empire, have distinguished themselves in the many wars in which the kingdom and empire have participated. Today, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland each have their own parliaments, and each has managed to maintain a degree of social identity as well as some degree of self-rule. Oddly, there's no separate English parliament, although perhaps one isn't necessary since England controls the larger share of the parliament of the United Kingdom. But I am told, and I really don't want to get into the middle of this, that some English people are still in the very bad habit of referring to the four nations collectively as England, even though I was told they should know better. That is an error to which I will sincerely try not to contribute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.